The night felt calm at first, the kind of quiet that comes after a long, busy day. The studio lights had already been turned off and the hall stood empty. Keanu and Sandra walked side by side toward the parking area, talking softly about their day and feeling a little tired but peaceful. The cool air touched their faces as they stepped outside, and the silence around them created a gentle pause in their thoughts. Everything seemed normal until a strange sound interrupted the calm. It was a soft cry coming from somewhere behind the parked cars. The sound was faint but filled with fear. Sandra stopped walking at once. Keanu turned his head slowly and listened again. The cry came a second time, and this time it felt a little weaker. Sandra frowned and whispered that maybe it was a lost child. Keanu thought it sounded smaller than that, like an animal in trouble. The sound created an uneasy feeling in their hearts, and both of them knew they could not ignore it. They walked carefully between the rows of parked cars. The night lights cast long shadows on the ground, and the air felt colder the deeper they went. The cry came again, shaking a little as if the creature behind it was losing strength. Every step they took increased their worry. Sandra felt her heartbeat rise as she imagined what could be waiting in the darkness. Keanu moved slowly, watching every corner and every shadow, trying not to startle whatever was hidden there. After a few more steps, they saw a small piece of wood lying crooked on the ground. It looked like a broken crate that had fallen from somewhere. Beneath it, something moved slightly. Sandra froze for a moment, then whispered to Keanu that something was trapped under it. He knelt down slowly and looked through a small gap under the crate. When his eyes adjusted, he saw a small, injured dog curled up tightly. The dog was shaking and trying to pull its leg back, but something was holding it down. Sandra covered her mouth gently as she saw the fear in its eyes. Keanu spoke softly to the dog, telling it that he was there to help. His voice was calm and gentle, but the dog still trembled. Sandra knelt beside him and tried to comfort the frightened animal with her voice. She noticed the crate was heavy and unstable. If it slipped or moved the wrong way, it could hurt the dog even more. Sandra worried that touching it might cause more harm. Keanu placed his hands under the edge of the crate to test its weight. He felt the pressure and realized it was heavier than he expected. Sandra told him he should not lift it alone. He looked at her and gave a small nod, but he also knew that the dog was losing strength and waiting too long could be dangerous. The dog whimpered softly, its voice shaking as if it was calling for help. Sandra looked around for anyone who could assist, but the parking area was empty and quiet. She felt helpless for a moment, and her worry grew deeper. Keanu took a slow breath and lifted the crate a little. The wood creaked and shifted. The dog panicked and pushed itself backward, causing the crate to tilt dangerously. Sandra reacted quickly and held the other side of the crate to keep it steady. Her arms shook, but she did not let go. She spoke softly to the dog again, telling it to stay calm. The dog looked at her with frightened eyes, but it began to breathe a little slower. Keanu lifted higher and Sandra adjusted her grip. The crate rose enough for the dog to move out, but it remained frozen, too scared to run. Sandra reached her hand slowly and the dog sniffed her fingers. With a gentle movement, she slid her hand under its chest and pulled it out carefully. As soon as she lifted the dog, she saw something that made her stomach drop. The dog's leg was trapped inside a tight metal wire that was cutting into its skin. There was a small amount of blood and the wound looked painful. The dog cried again and pressed its face against Sandra's arm. Keanu lowered the crate with control and stepped closer to look at the wire. His eyes filled with worry as he studied the metal. Removing it would be hard. If they pulled too quickly, the wire could cause more injury. Sandra held the dog close and looked around the parking lot to find help or tools, but she saw nothing. The night felt even darker now, and the situation felt more urgent. Keanu reached into his bag and found a small pocket tool. It was not very large, but it was sharp enough to cut metal if used carefully. Sandra felt a little hope, but also fear because the dog was shaking too much. Keanu touched the wire gently and the dog cried again. Sandra whispered soft words and stroked its head. The dog slowly began to relax in her arms, but the fear did not disappear completely. Keanu tried to find the right angle to cut the wire without hurting the dog. He focused so deeply that he did not notice a pair of headlights moving toward them. Sandra turned her head and saw a car approaching from behind. The car was moving slowly, but it was coming directly toward their hidden corner between the parked vehicles. If the driver did not see them in time, they could all be in danger. Sandra's breath stopped for a moment, and she held the dog tighter. The sound of the engine grew louder and the headlights brightened the area. Keanu looked up quickly and saw the same danger she had seen. He stood halfway, unsure if he should cut the wire first or stop the car before something worse happened. The dog in Sandra's arms trembled again as the lights came closer. The moment felt heavy and tense. Every second passed like a long stretch of fear. Keanu needed to decide fast. Sandra's eyes moved between the dog and the approaching car. She hoped the driver would notice them, but the car did not slow down yet. The dog let out another weak cry, and Sandra held it even closer. They were stuck between danger and panic, waiting for what would happen next. The headlights grew brighter with every passing second. Sandra felt the light hit her face, and she raised her arm slightly to shield the dog. The animal trembled harder as the sound of the engine filled the narrow space between the cars. Keanu knew he had only a moment to act. He stepped forward and waved both hands high in the air. The driver reacted late but still managed to press the brake. The tires made a soft screech, and the car stopped only a few steps away from them. Sandra let out a shaky breath and held the dog closer. The driver opened the door in confusion and asked what they were doing crouched between cars in the dark. Keanu explained quickly and pointed to the injured dog. The driver's expression changed from confusion to worry as he saw the wire stuck in the tiny leg. The dog let out another soft cry, and Sandra tried her best to calm it with her voice. Her hands shook not from fear now, but from the deep desire to help the weak creature. Keanu returned his focus to the metal wire. The small pocket tool felt cold in his hand. He positioned it carefully and studied the twisted metal. The wire was tight and sharp. One wrong movement could cause more pain. Sandra kept whispering gentle words as the dog pressed its face against her arm. The driver stepped closer and switched on the flashlight of his phone to give them more light. The new brightness helped Keanu see how deeply the wire was cutting into the skin. Keanu placed the tool around the wire and applied slow pressure. The metal resisted, and the dog cried again, shaking in Sandra's arms. Sandra tried to stay calm even though her heart felt heavy with helplessness. Keanu continued cutting inch by inch. His hand moved slowly, steady but tense. The wire finally started to loosen, but before he could cut completely, the tool slipped for a moment and scraped his palm. A thin line of blood appeared on his hand. Sandra gasped softly, but Keanu told her he was fine and kept going without hesitation. His focus was only on the dog. The animal needed them more than anything else at that moment. The wire snapped suddenly and bounced backward, hitting Keanu's skin again. He winced but did not pull back. He held the wire away from the dog's leg, and Sandra gently moved the injured limb free. The wound looked deeper than they thought. The dog whimpered and leaned weakly against her chest. Sandra felt tears gather in her eyes, but she blinked them away, knowing the little creature needed her strength. Keanu looked at the wound with concern. He knew they needed a vet, and they needed to reach one fast. Sandra asked the driver if he knew any nearby emergency animal clinics. The driver nodded, but said the closest one had closed an hour ago because it was late. This news made Sandra's heart sink for a moment. She looked at the dog, whose breathing had become slow and shallow. Waiting until morning was not an option. The driver then said there was another emergency clinic across town. It was open all night but far away, and the streets were usually busy at this time due to road repairs. They feared losing precious minutes. Keanu did not waste a second. He told Sandra to get in his car with the dog while he thanked the driver for stopping in time. The driver wished them good luck and returned to his car. Sandra rushed toward Keanu's car with the dog held gently against her chest. The animal felt light and fragile, like it could slip away if she did not hold it close. Keanu started the engine, and Sandra settled into the seat, keeping the dog wrapped in her arms to keep it warm. The car moved quickly out of the parking lot and into the street. The city lights stretched across the roads, reflecting on the windshield. Sandra whispered to the dog, telling it that everything would be all right. The dog's eyes opened slightly, but it was too weak to move. Keanu kept his eyes on the road, pushing the car forward but staying careful. His injured hand tightened on the steering wheel. He felt the sting of the cut but ignored it. All that mattered was reaching the clinic before the dog lost any more strength. As they drove, the dog's breathing became uneven. Sandra felt panic rise inside her. She told Keanu they needed to go faster. Keanu pressed the accelerator a little more, but the roads soon became crowded. Cars lined up ahead and the traffic suddenly slowed down. Sandra looked toward the far end and saw orange construction cones blocking part of the road. Workers were guiding traffic into a narrow single lane. It was moving painfully slow. Sandra held the dog closer and whispered again, begging it to stay awake. Every minute they lost made her feel more desperate. Keanu turned to her and told her gently that they would make it. His voice was calm even though the situation was tense. He looked out the window and saw a worker holding a stop sign. Cars were stopped for a long time. They could not afford to wait. Keanu stepped out of the car quickly and walked to the worker. Sandra watched nervously, her heart pounding as she held the dog. She saw Keanu talking to the worker, pointing at the injured animal in her arms. The worker seemed unsure at first, shaking his head as if rules would not allow them to pass. Keanu spoke again, his voice firm but respectful. The worker looked at the dog and paused for a moment, then changed his mind and signaled them to drive through the blocked lane. Keanu ran back to the car, opened the door, and drove slowly past the construction area. Sandra's voice shook as she told the dog to keep breathing. The dog opened its eyes for a brief second, then closed them again. A heavy fear spread across Sandra's chest. She felt the dog growing weaker, and her hands felt cold as she continued holding it. Keanu kept driving as fast as the road allowed. Sandra stared at the street signs ahead and finally saw the bright, glowing sign of the emergency animal hospital. Her heart filled with hope again, but the dog's small body felt even lighter in her arms now. She whispered its name even though it had none. She only wanted it to stay with them until help arrived. The car turned sharply into the hospital parking area and came to a stop. Keanu jumped out to help her. Sandra held the dog tightly as she stepped out. The hospital doors opened automatically, casting bright light across their worried faces. The bright lights inside the emergency animal hospital made Sandra blink for a moment as she entered with the weak dog in her arms. The air smelled of medicine and quiet tension. Keanu stayed right beside her, guiding her gently toward the reception desk. The nurse behind the counter noticed the panic on their faces and rushed toward them before they even spoke. Sandra explained everything quickly while holding the shaking animal close. The nurse listened carefully and then pressed a button to call the emergency vet. Within seconds, a door opened, and a vet wearing gentle eyes stepped out with a small team. They placed a soft blanket on a stretcher and asked Sandra to set the dog on it. Sandra hesitated for a moment, afraid to let go, but she knew this was the only chance to save its life. She placed the dog slowly on the blanket, whispering a soft promise that she would not leave. The vet checked the dog's breathing and the wound on its leg. The cut was deep and there were signs of stress in the dog's body. The vet spoke calmly but with urgency. He said the dog needed immediate treatment because its body was becoming weak from the pain and the trapped wire had restricted blood flow. Sandra felt her heart tighten as she listened. Keanu asked what they needed to do. The vet told them there were risks, but they would do everything possible to save the little creature. They wheeled the dog into the treatment room while Sandra watched with trembling hands. The door closed behind the team, leaving only silence in the hallway. Sandra stood still for a moment before her knees softened. Keanu placed his hand gently on her back and led her to a seat in the waiting area. She sat slowly, but her eyes did not leave the closed door. The room felt wide yet heavy with quiet fear. A few other people waited too, each carrying their own worries. Sandra rested her hands on her lap, but they continued to shake. Keanu looked at her with concern and noticed something he had ignored earlier. His own hand was bleeding more than before. Sandra's breath caught for a moment as she saw the dry blood on his skin. She reached for his hand gently and looked at him with soft eyes filled with emotion. Keanu tried to brush it off and said it was fine, but Sandra shook her head. She took a tissue from the counter and cleaned the wound slowly, as if caring for something delicate. Her movements were soft and warm. The pain on his hand did not bother him now. What he felt more strongly was the deep sincerity in her touch. Her eyes glistened with worry for both him and the injured dog. She held his hand for a moment longer and whispered softly that she was grateful he acted so bravely. Keanu smiled gently and told her he could not stand still when something needed help. Sandra nodded and looked back toward the treatment door. Minutes began passing like hours. The waiting room remained quiet, but every ticking second felt like a heavy thought inside their hearts. Sandra leaned forward, elbows on her knees, fingers intertwined tightly. She replayed every moment of the rescue in her mind, wondering if they had found the dog just in time or if they were too late. Keanu watched her quietly, knowing she carried the weight of fear deeply. The vet had not returned yet, and that made the silence even more intense. Sandra took a slow breath and whispered that she hoped the dog was fighting. Keanu placed his hand gently on her shoulder and told her that they did everything they could. 10 more minutes passed. The door opened and the vet walked out with a serious expression. Sandra stood quickly, her heart racing as she waited for him to speak. The vet explained that the dog was in critical condition because the wire had cut deeply and caused swelling. He said the animal also had internal stress and needed urgent medical care. He told them the treatment would be long and a bit costly, but there was still hope. Sandra looked at Keanu, waiting for his reaction. Without even thinking twice, Keanu told the vet to begin whatever treatment was needed, and they would take full responsibility. His voice was steady and kind. Sandra felt warmth grow inside her as she realized how far he was willing to go for a life that could not even speak. The vet nodded and returned to the room. Sandra and Keanu sat again, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Fear was still there, but now it mixed with hope. Sandra leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. She whispered a silent prayer that the little creature would find strength to survive. Keanu watched her shoulders rise and fall with each slow breath. He could see how much she cared even for something she had met only minutes ago. That kindness, that deep compassion, made him look at her with quiet respect. Another stretch of time passed, slower than before. The hallway lights hummed softly as they waited. Sandra kept glancing at the treatment door, hoping it would open again. Keanu rested his hands on his knees and looked at the floor, thinking about the moment they had found the dog and how everything changed so quickly. He remembered how scared the dog had been and how Sandra held it as if it were something precious. His chest felt tight when he remembered the sound of its cries. He hoped they reached it in time. He hoped this night would end with good news. After what felt like forever, the door finally opened again. The vet stepped out slowly, but this time his face held a small, gentle smile. Sandra stood up immediately, feeling her heart jump. Keanu rose beside her with quiet anticipation. The vet told them the dog was now stable. He said the surgery to remove the damaged tissue had gone well and the swelling was under control. The dog was still weak and needed rest, but its chances of healing were much better now. Sandra felt tears rise in her eyes as relief washed over her. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying to breathe through the emotion growing inside her. Keanu felt the same wave of relief and thanked the vet sincerely. They followed the vet into the treatment room where the dog lay on a soft blanket connected to small tubes for support. Its breathing was steady but slow. Sandra walked gently toward it and touched its head lightly. The dog opened its eyes halfway and looked at her as if remembering her voice. The connection was quiet but emotional. Keanu stood on the other side and looked at the tiny creature with soft eyes. The room felt peaceful even with all the medical equipment around them. Sandra whispered that they were here, and the dog was no longer alone. The room felt quiet as Sandra and Keanu stood beside the small dog resting on the warm blanket. The soft sound of the machine beside it created a gentle rhythm in the air. Sandra watched the slow rise and fall of the dog's chest and felt a warm wave of relief mixed with fear. The dog was safe now, but still far from healed. She placed her hand lightly on its head. The dog blinked slowly, its eyes filled with exhaustion but also trust. Sandra whispered softly, telling it that everything would be okay. Keanu stood beside her with calm eyes, watching the peaceful moment with deep respect. The vet explained that the next few hours were important. The dog needed rest and monitoring. He told them they could wait in the observation room while the dog was moved there for continued care. Sandra nodded, though her heart felt heavy leaving the dog for even a moment. She brushed her hand over its fur one more time before stepping back. Keanu touched her arm gently, guiding her toward the hallway. The vet and his team worked carefully to lift the dog onto a small padded bed that rolled on quiet wheels. Sandra followed the movement with her eyes until the dog disappeared into the next room. The observation room had soft lights and a warm atmosphere meant to comfort worried owners. As they entered, Sandra sat down slowly on a chair by the wall. Keanu sat beside her. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of air coming from the vents. Sandra took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. The emotions of the night were settling inside her all at once. She thought about how a simple walk to the parking lot had led to this moment. It made her realize how quickly life could change, not only for people but for helpless animals too. Keanu noticed the way she held her hands together tightly. He leaned forward slightly and asked if she was all right. She looked at him with tired eyes but gave a small nod. She said she was just grateful they found the dog in time. Keanu agreed and added that if they had walked a little faster or taken a different path, they might not have heard the cries at all. The thought made Sandra shiver. She imagined the little animal waiting alone, slowly losing hope. The idea was too painful, and she pressed her hands together even tighter. Keanu rested his injured hand on his knee. The cut had dried but still looked raw. Sandra noticed and reached for his hand again. She held it gently and studied the wound carefully. Keanu felt a soft warmth spread through him at her touch. She whispered that he always put others before himself, and she admired that. He smiled in a quiet and humble way, telling her anyone would do the same. But Sandra shook her head. She knew he was only being modest. She had seen many people walk past suffering without stopping, but Keanu had moved without hesitation. He had not cared about danger, dirt, or time. He had cared about saving a life. That meant something deeper to her. A quiet knock on the door interrupted their moment. The vet stepped in and told them the dog was resting well. He said they could visit it again once it settled. Sandra stood up quickly, eager to see the dog again. Keanu rose too, following the vet back to the observation area. When they reached the room, they saw the dog lying comfortably on the padded bed. Its breathing was steady and its eyes fluttered open when it sensed their presence. Sandra stepped closer and knelt beside it. Her face softened with relief as she stroked its fur. The vet told them that the dog was dehydrated and exhausted, so they were giving it fluids. He also mentioned that the dog had no identification tag, meaning it might be a stray or lost. Sandra felt a sharp ache in her chest at the thought. She brushed her fingers gently through its fur and whispered that it was not alone anymore. Keanu stood quietly beside her, watching her with admiration. Her compassion made the room feel warmer. As time passed, Sandra and Keanu stayed close to the dog. They spoke softly to each other, sharing thoughts about how something so small could bring such a powerful shift in their night. Sandra touched the dog's paw and felt the tiniest response. The dog moved its paw slightly, as if acknowledging her. Sandra smiled softly with tears forming at the corner of her eyes. She whispered that the little one was strong and brave. Keanu leaned closer to see the movement too. He felt a warm feeling rise in his chest when he saw the bond forming between Sandra and the dog. A nurse entered the room with a small update chart. She wrote down the dog's vital signs and smiled at them politely. She said the dog seemed calmer because it could hear familiar voices nearby. Hearing that made Sandra hold the dog's paw even more gently. She whispered that they would stay as long as the dog needed. Keanu nodded in agreement. There was no part of him that wanted to leave either. After a while, the nurse said the dog needed to rest without too much noise. Sandra understood and slowly stood up. Keanu helped her with a gentle hand on her back. They looked at the dog one last time before stepping out of the room. The door closed softly behind them, and they returned to the observation room. Sandra sat down and leaned her head back against the wall. Her eyes looked tired but peaceful. She closed them for a moment and let the silence hold her. Keanu watched her for a few seconds, noticing how heavy the night had been on her yet how strong she remained. He sat beside her and placed his hand gently over hers. She opened her eyes and looked at him with a soft expression. She whispered that she hoped the dog felt safe now. Keanu told her that he believed it did because of her kindness. Sandra felt warmth in her heart and lowered her eyes for a moment, hiding the emotion on her face. She felt grateful for Keanu standing beside her through everything, not only as a friend, but as someone who shared her values of compassion and respect. The moment felt calm and meaningful. Time passed slowly until the vet returned again. He told them the dog was stable enough for the night and they could stay as long as they wished. Sandra and Keanu exchanged a quiet look. Neither of them wanted to leave. The night was long, but they stayed, surrounded by soft lights, quiet rooms, and the silent hope that the little dog would wake up stronger. The night continued slowly, and the hospital felt quieter than before. Soft lights glowed along the hall, and only the distant beeping of machines broke the calm. Sandra and Keanu sat together in the observation room, both tired but unable to rest. Their thoughts stayed with the small dog fighting for strength in the next room. Sandra leaned forward with her elbows on her knees, her fingers gently touching each other. She had been strong the entire night, but now the weight of worry settled onto her shoulders in a deeper way. Keanu noticed her silence and reached out with a careful hand, resting it lightly on hers. She looked up at him, her eyes soft but tired. Keanu whispered that they had done everything they could. His voice was gentle, steady, and full of calm. He told her that the dog was finally safe after hours of fear and pain. Sandra nodded slowly, but her heart still felt heavy. She whispered that she hated the idea of any creature suffering alone in the dark. She said she kept thinking about how the dog must have felt trapped under the crate, waiting for someone to notice it. Keanu listened quietly, respecting every emotion she shared. He told her that the dog was lucky because she found it, and she refused to leave it alone. Her kindness was the reason they reached the hospital in time. A nurse entered the observation room carrying a small tray with warm drinks. She smiled gently at them and placed the cups on the table. She told them that the vet was preparing another update. Sandra thanked her softly and wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the heat calm her shaking fingers. Keanu did the same, though he still felt the sting on his injured hand. The warmth helped distract him for a moment. They sipped quietly and stared at the wall as the minutes stretched into a long, emotional silence. After a short while, the vet stepped into the room again. He held a chart and his expression looked more relaxed than earlier. Sandra stood quickly, her heart racing. Keanu rose beside her with steady calmness. The vet explained that the dog had responded well to the treatment so far. The internal stress was easing, the swelling around the leg was reducing, and the animal was breathing more comfortably. He said the dog would still need several days of care, but the hardest part was over. Sandra felt her knees weaken slightly from relief. She let out a slow breath and placed her hand over her heart. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, grateful for the good news. Sandra asked if they could see the dog again. The vet nodded and guided them to the room. When they entered, the small dog lay curled on the blanket with its eyes partly open. The weak tremble from before had eased. Sandra walked closer and knelt beside it. She whispered its name again, though it still had none. The dog lifted its paw slightly as if reaching for her. The gesture touched her deeply. She placed her hand gently under its paw and held it softly. Keanu stood on the other side, watching with warmth in his eyes. The vet stepped forward and explained something important. He told them that once the dog recovered enough to leave the hospital, it would need a foster home for a few weeks. He said they needed someone patient and gentle to help it heal completely. The words hung heavily in the air for a moment. Sandra slowly lifted her eyes toward Keanu. Keanu met her gaze, and without speaking they both understood what the other was thinking. Sandra looked back at the dog and whispered that leaving it alone after all this felt impossible. Her voice shook with emotion. Keanu agreed softly. He said the dog trusted them now, and they had a responsibility to keep it safe. The vet smiled when he heard their decision. He told them he would prepare the necessary paperwork and keep them updated on the dog's progress. Sandra felt a soft warmth spread through her chest. She looked at Keanu with a grateful smile. He returned the smile with quiet humility. They stood together beside the dog, watching its small, steady breaths. The moment felt peaceful, like a soft pause after a long storm. After the vet left the room, Sandra continued to sit by the dog's side. She stroked its fur slowly, letting her fingers move gently along its back. She whispered that they were not going anywhere. The dog closed its eyes again, as if comforted by her words. Keanu sat next to her and leaned back against the wall. The tiredness of the night finally started catching up with him. Sandra rested her head on his shoulder without thinking. He did not move away. Instead, he shifted slightly so she could rest more comfortably. They stayed like that for a while, quiet and calm. The room felt filled with a peaceful warmth. Sandra whispered that she was glad they stayed at the studio late, because if they had left earlier, they might never have heard the cry. Keanu nodded and said sometimes life guides people to the right moment when kindness is needed most. His voice carried a deep sincerity that made Sandra smile softly. The vet returned once more to tell them the dog was resting well enough for the moment and they could take a break. Sandra and Keanu stepped outside the treatment room. The hallway felt lighter than before. They walked to the seating area again and sat side by side. Sandra leaned back and closed her eyes. Keanu watched her for a short moment, then rested his head gently against the wall, feeling the long night settle inside him. Sandra turned her head slowly and looked at him. She whispered that she felt grateful he had been with her through everything. Keanu smiled softly and told her that kindness always grows stronger when shared. Sandra felt tears form again, but this time they carried relief, not fear. The night had changed them both in a quiet but deep way. They had walked into darkness with worry, but now they waited in a place filled with hope. The dog's life had touched their hearts more than they expected, and through every moment of fear and responsibility, they stood beside each other with respect and silent understanding. The night slowly turned into morning as a soft, pale light entered through the hospital windows. Sandra and Keanu had not slept, but neither felt tired anymore. The long hours of fear and waiting had changed into quiet hope. When the vet entered with a gentle smile, Sandra stood at once. Keanu rose beside her, his expression calm but filled with anticipation. The vet told them the dog had made it through the night without any complications. Its breathing was stable and its heart rate had become stronger. Sandra placed her hand over her chest and let out a deep, grateful breath. Keanu smiled softly at the good news, the tension easing from his eyes. The vet guided them back into the observation room. When they entered, Sandra walked straight to the small bed where the dog lay. Its eyes opened slowly, this time with more clarity than before. Sandra knelt beside it and whispered a soft greeting. The dog moved its paw weakly toward her hand. Sandra placed her fingers gently under it and felt the tiny touch. Keanu stood close and watched with warmth in his heart. The connection between Sandra and the dog felt even stronger now. It was no longer just rescue. It was trust, comfort, and quiet affection. The vet stepped closer and said the dog still needed days of care and monitoring. He explained that they would have to bring it back for checkups, but he believed the dog would recover fully. Sandra looked at Keanu, her eyes shining with emotion. She whispered that they could not leave the dog alone now. Keanu nodded instantly. He agreed with her completely. He said the dog had already been through too much, and it deserved safety and love. Sandra felt the weight of his words, and her heart softened even more. The vet brought a small folder for Sandra and Keanu to sign. It included the authorization for them to foster the dog during its recovery. Sandra signed without hesitation. Keanu placed his name gently beside hers. When the papers were complete, the vet thanked them for their kindness. He told them that not many people would go to such lengths for a helpless creature they had only just found. Sandra lowered her gaze shyly and said it never mattered if someone or something was small. What mattered was whether it needed help. Keanu looked at her with deep admiration, understanding every word she spoke. As they prepared to leave, a nurse brought a soft carrier lined with warm blankets. She placed the dog inside gently. The little creature looked up at them with weak but trusting eyes. Sandra whispered that it was going home with them now. Keanu held the carrier with steady hands, making sure to keep it level and comfortable. The nurse told them to return later for follow-up treatment. Sandra promised they would. They stepped outside into the bright morning air. The world looked different now, warmer and calmer. The sky glowed with early sunlight, and a cool, gentle breeze brushed across their faces. Keanu carried the dog carefully while Sandra walked close beside him. They reached the car and placed the carrier safely on the seat. Sandra sat next to it and kept her hand inside the carrier so the dog could feel her presence. Keanu started the engine, and they drove through the quiet streets, feeling a sense of peace they had not felt in the long night before. As they drove, Sandra whispered that she never expected their night to change so deeply. She said she felt grateful they were together through all the chaos. Keanu glanced at her with a soft smile. He said sometimes life brings unexpected moments not to test us, but to remind us of who we truly are. She looked down at the dog resting against her hand and nodded quietly. When they arrived at Sandra's home, Keanu carried the dog inside while Sandra prepared a small space near the couch with soft blankets and a bowl of water. They placed the dog gently on the blanket. It curled up slowly, its tiny body relaxing as it sensed safety. Sandra sat beside it and stroked its fur. Keanu sat on the other side. For a moment, the room felt filled with calm warmth. Sandra whispered that they needed a name for the little one. Keanu thought quietly, then suggested a simple name that meant hope. Sandra repeated the name softly, and the dog lifted its head as if responding. She smiled with quiet joy. Hours passed, and Sandra and Keanu stayed with the dog, taking turns checking its breathing and giving it water. The dog slowly gathered more strength. Every small movement felt like a victory. Every soft sigh from the dog filled them with relief. Sandra rested her head lightly on Keanu's shoulder. He leaned his head toward hers gently. The moment did not need words. At some point, Sandra whispered that she would never forget the way Keanu lifted the crate and faced danger just to save a helpless life. She told him his heart was stronger than he ever admitted. Keanu looked at her with calm humility and said kindness began with her voice that soothed the trembling dog. He told her she gave the little creature the courage to survive. Their eyes met with quiet respect. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was simple, sincere, and full of meaning. The day slowly moved forward. The dog slept peacefully between them, protected, safe, and no longer alone. Sandra placed her hand gently over its small body. Keanu covered her hand softly with his. The three of them sat in silence, surrounded by morning light, breathing in the peace of rescue, compassion, and shared strength. That morning became something neither of them would forget. Not because of fear or struggle, but because of the kindness they offered without thinking and the respect they grew for each other through every moment. They saved the dog, but the gentle truth was that the dog had also brought them closer in a way they never expected.